So, what is the role and purpose of production? Generally speaking, in the animation industry, we have service roles and we have creative roles. A creative role, for example, might include people in design, modeling, lighting, compositing, effects, and of course, animation. An example of a service role includes rigging, IT, pipeline, technical animation, or shot filing, depending on what term your studio uses, and of course, production. Like every other department in animation, production is based on a hierarchy. Generally speaking, you have your coordinators, production managers, and producers. What you are actually responsible for in that role will vary quite a bit from studio to studio, so it's best to check the job description. Generally speaking, if you have associate or senior in your title, senior will obviously speak to your seniority and experience within that role, and associate tends to mean junior. So if you're an associate production manager, you are junior to the production manager role, and your next promotion, you will probably be promoted to production manager. Again, it varies a lot from studio to studio, but what always remains the same is that hierarchy. Ultimately, all of these roles usually answer to the head of production. If you're a production coordinator, you are usually responsible for a given department or departments depending on what type of show you're working on. So for example, in my first role as a coordinator, I did design and modeling. In my second role as a coordinator at a different studio, I did the effects team and 2 of the 3 lighting teams. When you move on to being a PM, you're more responsible for the schedule and staff management. When you are a producer, you have your eyes on the budget, client relations are huge, and of course, managing your team as a whole. Generally speaking, the higher up you go in production, the less active you are on the floor day to day. That's generally speaking, but again, very much depends on your studio's approach to how they structure production. Regardless of your specific role in production, I would say that production teams in general have 4 primary responsibilities. The first is to facilitate strong and effective communication for all of your teams. The second is to deliver the show at the standard of the studio via the means approved by the studio. The third is to make sure the teams have what they need to get the job done. I will say at this point that production is not an island. Teamwork is essential to the production role. In this case specifically, you're working with your IT team to make sure that your artists have the software and equipment they need. You're working with your supervisors to make sure that your artists have the mentorship and support they need to continue to grow as artists in your studio. The last primary responsibility of production, in my opinion, is that we should provide an example of the studio or company's values in achieving the goal. One of the trickier things that I wanted to talk about when discussing the role and purpose of production is that I personally believe that production is very much a position of power. This is because we often have access to more information ahead of the rest of our crew, and that information is often sensitive in one way or another. I would ask that if you're in production currently or you're looking to get into it, be aware of your motivations. If you're looking for a power trip, wrong job, wrong industry. I would also caution you to be aware of the boundaries that you have with your teams. Remember, as production, our duty and what we're being paid for every 2 weeks, first and foremost, is to the show and studio. Your integrity as a coordinator, production manager, and producer is invaluable to the success of the show and the studio as a whole. Lastly, to be perfectly blunt, and I'm going to say it at any rate, don't get romantically involved with your direct reports. It always looks unprofessional or like an error in judgment. The last thing that I wanted to touch upon for this lesson is that there is something to learn from all management styles. Within reason, we in production need to give people the space to flex their own management muscles. And if things become abusive or in line with harassment, that is a different conversation for another time. We need to remember that our own management styles are closely tied to how we learn and communicate. And just because we see somebody doing something different from how we are doing things, it doesn't mean they're doing it wrong. In fact, in my time in this industry, I have answered to 7 different producers who have all run their show differently and managed me differently. And I have to say that I have learned something valuable from all of them. We have our own management style, our supervisors and other production teams have another, and it takes all sorts to make this work.